Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Welcome back to my top 5 favorite monster series. So it's 5 videos where I talk about some of my favorite monsters to use in Dungeons & Dragons. So we're at our final 2, and at number 2 is the Illithid, the Mindflayer. Mindflayer has been one of my favorite monsters for quite some time, just in the way that it looked and the ideas behind it. I didn't really use it a lot until more recently in my DMing career. And for me, it really kind of goes back to when I picked up the book Lords of Madness for 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons. This is where I really got sort of inspired to work on something involving a Mind Flayer. What's cool about the Mind Flayers is just, again, the way that they've been presented. They're sort of enigmatic and mysterious, and their past is kind of a mystery. There was a trilogy of adventures for 2nd edition AD&D that I would love to get, which kind of outlines what they are, where they came from, and what their plans are. And there may be a little bit of spoilers in this, and I'm hoping that I'm remembering this correctly because it's been a long time since I heard about these. So again, I'm kind of working off memory here. But what the premise behind the Mind Flayers is that they actually come from the future, from a future age, and they, in an attempt to escape some sort of catastrophe, they ended up, I guess, traveling back through like time and space. Their main goal, their main objective, is to, I guess, extinguish the sun, or at least in these series of adventures, that was their main thing, was to extinguish the sun and bring about this new age for them. And again, they were just always kind of interesting. I mean, they're a creature that has like the face of an octopus, it's got like the tentacles hanging down, and they eat brains. Again, just a really interesting creature, which sounds kind of weird on the surface, but it's something that, again, I've just always loved from a very, very early point in my DMing career, although I never really used them. Like I said, that did change when I picked up not only Lords of Madness, but a little bit of a seed of inspiration for an adventure using Mind Flayers came with the release of the Monster Manual 2 for 3.0 Dungeons & Dragons. And the main thing that I really wanted to focus on when it came to the Mind Flayers was how they procreate. And for those who are unaware, what basically happens is the Mind Flayers have this pool where they've got these tadpole-like creatures, which you can kind of see on these tongs there. And what they'll do is they'll, capture humanoid slaves, and they'll actually place one of these creatures, and they'll kind of burrow into the individual's ear. And what this little tadpole thing does is it starts basically eating the humanoid brain and replacing it with its, Mind Flayer kind of brain. Like, it just sort of eats the brain and then takes over the head cavity as this tadpole kind of evolves into this basically the brain for the new Mind Flayer. And in the end, the body transforms into that of the Illithid. Now, what was interesting is in Monster Manual 2 for 3.0 Dungeons & Dragons, they had the half Illithid template. And what that was is a template that you could apply to non-standard humanoid creatures. Certain things just didn't work well. It typically was like, the demi-humans, like elves, orcs, things like that, as well as humans made the best hosts. But if you put this little tadpole creature into something else, it would just create this sort of hybrid of whatever the original creature was with some Illithid abilities, such as the Mind Blast, and the ability to extract an opponent's brain if they've got them stunned and grapple with their tentacles. So it was really kind of cool, but I really didn't want to focus on what happens if the process goes wrong. I wanted to focus on what happens when the process goes right. So with these videos, what I like to do is sort of tell a little bit of stories of the encounters or adventures that I've run with these creatures. And for me, my favorite Mind Flayer based adventure was actually one that I had written in the hopes of submitting it to Wizards of the Coast for they had an open design test, or not test, an open design contest sort of thing open. For quite some time near the end of 3rd edition, or 3.5, and what you had to do is write a short adventure and design an item. So, or design an element for the game. So it could be a spell, it could be a magic item, or it could be I want to say feat, and those were the three things. You couldn't do like prestige classes or races or anything like that. It was something that was supposed to be relatively minor, but you had to use it in the adventure. So the item that I decided, I wanted to design this adventure around Mindflayers. And most Mindflayers are Psionicists or Arcanists, so they use either a lot of their psionic natural abilities like Mind Blast or things like that, or they will use arcane spells. I wanted to focus on a Mind Flayer that was more martially oriented, so he didn't really rely on like spell-like abilities. He did use his Mind Blast, but other than that, wasn't really going to rely on a lot of spells or spell-like abilities, and was going to focus on, actually combat. And so what I created were these magical hooks that would attach to the ends of the tentacles. And the way that the Mind Flayer extraction works is it has to grapple you with its tentacles, and it essentially has to maintain the hold on it. So if you are able to break free, then it doesn't get to do anything. But if it manages to maintain the hold on you, and you're unable to break away if it's got all of its tentacles grappled onto you, then it can spend an action and extract the brain. And that's sort of like an instant death thing. So what I had were these like metal hooks that would attach to the end of the tentacle, and they were designed to actually burrow into the flesh. And they dealt damage similar to, I think it was like a dagger or a short sword. I can't remember right now. It was either D4 or D6. And it would be piercing damage. And what was kind of cool about it is they were barbed. So what happened is they granted a circumstance bonus, I think it was, to the grapple checks if they were able to hit with it. And this Mind Flayer was also able to treat it like a weapon. So he was able to take like weapon focus. So he got like an extra +1 to the attack rolls and stuff like that. But so these magical hooks, if they hit, they would burrow into the flesh of the victim. And what it does is, if they manage to break the grapple, then they take extra damage as they're sort of ripping these things out of their flesh. So it's incredibly painful, and it means that even if you manage to break the Mind Flayer's grapple, it's still going to be unpleasant. So you're still going to take some decent damage, because I think he had 2 of these hooks on. So if he managed to latch on with both of them, then that was like 2d6 or 2d4 damage, I think, that you'd end up taking. And I want to say that the strength bonus of the individual breaking the grapple played into it, if I recall correctly. It's been a while since I looked at it, but I always thought they were kind of cool. The premise behind the adventure was sort of to introduce the Mind Flayer reproductive system, I guess, whatever you want to call it. And so what these Mind Flayers did, or what this one Mind Flayer did, is he wanted to create an army. So he wanted to create just a bunch of other Mind Flayers for the purposes of taking over the region. Like, he wasn't focused on sort of the big picture like the other Mind Flayers. He was very much sort of an individual, not part of the hive mind, and just wanted to, basically wanted to conquer and conquest. So before, now this is sort of, I don't want to say necessarily taboo, but it kind of goes against what typically Mind Flayers are interested in. Mind Flayers are usually very sort of detached from their emotions, and desires to conquer small areas or regions isn't really as strong as the desire to achieve their racial major goal, which in editions past was again to blot out the sun. And obviously could change to other things in other editions, or however you want to do it. So this Mind Flayer ended up being basically exiled from its hive. So like the Elder Brain, which is like this huge brain that is sort of like the queen, you could almost say, of these Mind Flayers. And the Mind Flayers are not mindless by any stretch of the imagination. So even though they have sort of a hive mentality, they are independent. So they can function on their own, but they'll always do what they can for the betterment of their Elder Brain and stuff like that. So this one was exiled, but before he left, he scooped up a handful of these tadpole creatures and made off with them. So the player characters start hearing rumors that one of the sort of frontier villages is experiencing a rash of disappearances, and they're hired by the local lord in an attempt to find the most recently missing victim, which is his own son. So the player characters arrive at this village, and it's kind of late by the time that they do. But they get to talk to the duke, or the nobleman, the leader of the town. So they get to speak to him, and they also get to speak to some others and learn that these other people have also gone missing, and to kind of try to figure out if there's anything connecting them. And there really isn't much that sort of connects them personally, except for the fact that they all lived in this village. The characters get a description of the Lord Mayor's son, or the Duke's son. I can't remember if it was a Duke or Lord Mayor. I want to say it was Lord Mayor. Again, this is over a decade ago now, come to think of it. But anyway, so they find, find a description, or they get a description of the son, and not a whole lot, but the clothing that he was last wearing, like the color of his pants and shirt, and the shoes, and the fact that he had this unusual tattoo, which was, I guess, the family crest. But very few people in this area actually had tattoos, but he ended up having one of his family crest. And the player characters go to rest for the night, and they're awoken partway through the night as this mind flare is attacking the town. And it seems completely random with the characters. They go out, and at the level that they were at, they should have been able to easily deal with a single mind flare. It may cause a little bit of damage, but the intent wasn't really to hurt them or to cause them a lot of damage. It was to progress the story. So when they defeat this mind flare, they look at it, and this mind flare isn't garbed in what you would traditionally think of mind flares in, which are sort of like these these robes, and even this miniature sort of has like a very mind flare-esque looking robe to it. So this mind flare is wearing tattered clothing, which matched very closely to the description of the Lord Mayor's son, what he was wearing when he went missing. And when they examine him, like, he was wearing these leather boots that the mind flare's feet kind of burst out of. The clothes were kind of ripped and tattered and in a horrible state of disrepair. And when they examined the body of the mind flayer, they see the tattoo, which matches what the Lord Mayor's son had. So this thing was the Lord Mayor. And the player characters are able to track where the mind flayer came from, so they're able to follow its tracks. And following the tracks backwards, they do find that not too far outside of the town, the tracks were actually fully normal. Like the boots weren't ripped apart by these mind flayers' feet or anything like that. It was just a normal boot, and then a few steps later you kind of see like this more monstrous looking foot, which again just seemed like what would make sense for the transformation, so to speak, because it doesn't really talk about what happens during the transformation or what they look like necessarily after. So I took a few liberties by having like tattoos and identifying features still be present, but they track the tracks back to this this well that was actually on the property of a human ranger who was sort of known as protector of the town. This protector was unfortunately dominated by the mind flare. Luckily, in the two instances that I ran this adventure, both parties actually broke the domination instead of killing the ranger. So they break the hold on him, and they discover basically what happened. And what had happened is this ranger was actually captured by drow, a group of drow, and the drow sold him to this mind flayer, who instead of wanting to convert him at this point, he realized that this individual, seems very seasoned and someone that would probably be trusted. Like, he kind of infiltrated his mind and knew that this ranger was beloved by the nearby village. So he dominates him and gets the ranger to kind of lure these people away. The one thing that was kind of connecting them all together is the fact that a lot of them are sort of disenfranchised with the way that, their lot in life type of thing. So the idea would be that the rumor would be spread that they basically just fled the town in order to make a new life for themselves. But really what was happening is this ranger was capturing them, turning them over to the drow, and the drow were just selling them off as slaves. Most of them were being sold back to the Mind Flayer, but the Mind Flayer didn't want everything to be completely interconnected to him. So the drow slaver was sort of the buffer there, and the character, or the ranger, only knew about the drow. He remembered being captured by the drow, and he remembered where they took him, and then doesn't remember much after that. So like his memory was essentially modified. The player characters then go and investigate. They find the drow slavers, confront them, deal with them, and then they find their records, which indicate an individual by the name of Zarog, I think was the Mind Flayer name that I had, and that he had purchased, quite a few individuals. It also had the drow, because they don't really trust anyone and they don't want these Mind Flayers to get too out of control, they actually had a map back to the Mind Flayer's lair in the event that they were threatened by it and had to do something about it before, too many of these Mind Flayers were created. So they managed to find their way to the Mind Flayer's lair, and they confront it. And that was sort of like the main thing. When they arrive, there is a prison cell which had a few prisoners in there, one of whom was very early on in the transformation process, but there was another one that was very much near the end. So like his flesh was starting to turn like this purple, blue, kind of splotchy, molted color. And he was starting to develop like these tentacles that were hanging down, and the characters sort of had to figure out what they were going to do with them. And I think in most cases they kind of put them down. And there was a second cell which had just a single person in it who had just transformed. So it was just this ravenous, hungry Mind Flayer. And the end of the adventure, was the idea was they would confront this Mind Flayer. I would test out to see how the hooks worked, and the idea was to submit it to Wizards of the Coast. Fortunately, I didn't really get the chance to do so, mainly because around this time, shortly thereafter, I think 4th edition was announced, and as much as I would love to have sent, something in to be, actually work as a designer or developer for D&D, at that time I just wasn't interested in 4th edition. As an interesting side note, I did run this adventure twice. So the second, or the way that I kind of describe things is how they went with the second group. The first group had a lot of similarities, but it really all kind of fell apart when they confronted the drow. And, I'm sorry, but if the person who was a part of this is watching, I don't think he is, but I am sorry, but this has to be told. So the first group that I ran this adventure for, they followed all the clues. They found the drow slavers' hideout. And the drow priestess had was it flesh to stone prepared, and had like scrolls of break enchantment and disintegrate, I think was the other one, due to their domain spells. And so during the battle, the priestess was able to cast, or maybe she was a wizard. No, she was definitely a cleric. She ended up casting stone to flesh. Or flesh to stone, sorry. She cast flesh to stone on one of the characters, and the character failed their saving throw. So they were turned into a statue. Like they were that was it. They were petrified. And at the end of the battle, they were able to capture and subdue the priestess. And this is something I'll never forget. So one of the characters was adamant that she break the spell, that she cast like break enchantment or something to, bring the character back, sort of thing. And this individual was a spellcaster, and I believe he was a cleric. I'm pretty sure he was either a cleric or a wizard, but he was definitely a spellcaster, not like just a fighter type. So. But the wording is, so, she had these scrolls which were written in drow, so they couldn't read what they were. And she had 2 scrolls. Like I said, they had the scroll of break enchantment, and she had the scroll of disintegrate. And what had happened is she ended up bluffing them, saying that, yes, this is the scroll that will break the enchantment, And, you know, if you let me cast it, I can, you know, I can free your friend. And unfortunately, this player, who I think his intentions were pure, but what he ended up doing was, if I recall correctly, he basically told this Drow priestess that no matter what was going to happen, she was going to die. Like, they just, you know, he wasn't going to let her go, but he still wanted to intimidate her into breaking the petrification on this guy. So she was dead no matter what, and she's very spiteful. So she just said, you know, flat out, you know, yes, this is the spell of break enchantment. You know, will you let me cast it? And I say that she bluffed, but I don't think I actually rolled a bluff check, because the only character that was acting at this time was this other cleric. And you know, he's like, I say, you know, so she takes the scroll. Is there anything that you want to do, you know, as a precaution? And all he said is, if she does anything other than cast a spell, then he will strike her down. It was like, are you sure that's how you want to word it? And anyone who's played Dungeons & Dragons, or really any type of role-playing game, should know that if the DM asks, are you sure, you should probably rethink what you're doing. But that's how he worded it. He said, if she does anything other than cast a spell, and not even the spell, just a spell, then I will strike her down. It's like, okay. Now, this is someone who's been playing D&D with us for a while now, so I didn't really consider him to be a rookie. So I wasn't going to offer any extra suggestions. So I just say, you know, she takes the scroll, she unfurls it, and she begins chanting. You know, which would be sort of a clue that maybe the spellcaster that's observing her wants to use a what was the name of this skill in maybe spellcraft. I think spellcraft was the name of the skill in 3rd edition, but to make a check to make sure that she was casting the right spell. And that didn't happen. So I just looked at, you know, this other player, and I'm like, you know, I'm sorry, dude, but what happens is, you know, she reads the scroll and she points at the statue, and this sort of like sickly pale beam of light goes out from her finger, hits this inanimate object, and the disintegrate spell instantly destroys I think it's 10 cubic feet of inorganic matter, which this stone creature was now at this point, because he was, again, permanently petrified. And it just came down to the character died because this one player trusted the word of a drow priestess. And I want to say that was the worst thing that happened, but unfortunately it's not. So at the end of the adventure, this first group, down a player now, ends up you know, fighting through the Mindflayers lair. And they come to this very obvious, ominous door that screams dungeon bosses on the other side of this door. And at this point, the cleric wants to cast Enlarge Person on, I think it was a gnome, to make him like bigger and stronger and stuff like that. And the gnome didn't want the spell to be cast on him. And they argued loudly for quite some time. And because they were arguing about, you know, like, I'm going to cast this on you, it's like, you know, you guys realize that you're actually, you know, this is a conversation that your characters would probably be having. If you see the cleric going over to cast something on you and you don't want him to, you're going to tell him that you don't want him to do it, and they're going to, you know, he's going to ask why. And the conversation sounded like it was in character. So it was like, you know, at this point, it went on for a while. So it's like, you guys are arguing pretty loudly outside of this door, you know. If you want to have any chance at the element of surprise, you need to act now. So what happened is, one of the characters went to boot the door down, and it failed. They failed the roll. They rolled terribly. And instead of like trying again immediately, they then argued for another 5 minutes. So at this point, about what to do. So at this point, it's like, okay, even if they weren't arguing in character, they tried to kick down the door and failed, and spent several more minutes trying to figure things out. So it's like, at this point, the other Mind Flayer who's on the other side of the room is completely prepared. So what happened was, they finally decided just to check the door to see if it was locked, which, by the way, it wasn't. They opened the door, and the Mind Flayer on the other side had already prepared an action to use his Mind Blast on the door as soon as it opened. And so, lo and behold, the player characters opened the door. Every single one of them failed their saving throw against the stun. Every single one. Like, all three of the players failed their... actually, there were four. I think it was 5 players that I had. They all failed their roll. So at this point, I didn't even get to test the hooks out that I wanted to, this magic item that I created. So I just ended up racking up a TPK as this Mind Flayer because he only needed 2 rounds. And the stun lasted for quite a while, actually. Maybe I only had 3 players at this point. Maybe it was only 4 players total. But I do remember that the amount of rounds that everyone was stunned for, which basically rendered them more or less helpless, was long enough for the Mind Flayer to go up to each and every single one of them and extract their brains one at a time. So I ended up getting a TPK, which I believe was actually probably the first TPK I ever had. So there you go. The second group did a lot better. I did get to test the hooks out, and they worked pretty well. They weren't really overly powerful or broken. You know, they only gave, like, I think a +2 bonus to the grapple checks per hook or something like that. But the issue with it was that the individual who got grappled was a rogue in the second group, and the way that rogues worked in 3rd edition, or the way grapple worked in 3rd edition, was if you're grappled, you could still use a light weapon. And this rogue was using 2 daggers. And when you're grappling or grappled, both individuals are considered flat-footed. What flat-footed means is that a rogue attacking someone that's flat-footed gets their sneak attack off. So the Mind Flayer wrapped his tentacles around this guy's face, latched on, but the rogue just basically, shanked him with his daggers and took him out. So anyway, that was my Mind Flayer experience. It was still a fun adventure. I'm hoping to actually rewrite it because I'd like to put it up on like my Facebook or Patreon for anyone who follows. Either of those, and they can, download it as a PDF. So it's something that I like to go back and sort of redo. But that was my, like I said, my major Mind Flayer experience. It was the first adventure that I ran that really revolved around them, and I just thought it was kind of cool to do something with their mating rituals and how they actually create other Mind Flayers. So I thought that was just kind of a cool thing, and that was one of the things that really made me interested in the Mind Flayers, even more so than just the fact that they looked really cool even back in the day. So anyway, that was my video, that was my story. So let me know in the comments below if you guys have had any run-ins with the Illithids and sort of what your experiences were, and if you were a DM, have you ever designed adventures around Mind Flayers as the foes? Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I look forward to reading any and all comments and responses. And as always, if you have a YouTube channel of your own, this would be a great opportunity if you're looking to figure out some things to do for your channel. Make a video response and let me know because I would love to watch it. Anyway, thank you guys again for watching, and we'll see you next time.